As JJ McCarthy's rehab continues, maybe he's ahead of schedule, but that also complicates what the Vikings are going to do with Sam Darnold. The world turns on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you all so very much. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL, all lowercase, to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Today on the show, I want to talk about some trade candidates, and we'll get to that, but some reporting surfaced from Albert Breer. Albert Breer went on the Rich Eisen show, as did JJ McCarthy, giving us a little bit of a sort of package look at where things are going. And so here is the week we're in. We are in Super Bowl week. So we are learning some things. You notice how the Cooper Kupp thing and the Myles Garrett thing, they all are happening now. It doesn't that all seem like it's coinciding a lot? Well, that's because everyone is in New Orleans right now. Everyone who's anyone is currently going to Radio Row, doing their interviews, talking to each other, and meeting up with each other in the hallways, and finding each other at New Orleans bars. There is it's NFL Con at the Super Bowl, right? And so conversations start to happen, and guess what? All the reporters are there sniffing around all of that stuff too. I will always remember famously Kirk Cousins saying, Minnesota is really nice, and everyone kind of making a big deal about that. And then that got journalists to poke around, and then it became really apparent that Kirk Cousins was going to be a target for the Vikings in free agency. This was in 2018. In February 2018, when when Minnesota was hosting the Super Bowl. So the whole local beat was there, and this is where stuff happens. The next kind of big wave will be the owners meeting, where you'll see some headline about competition committee stuff, but also all the GMs are under one roof, or most of them. So that's when kind of some negotiations can happen, even though it's not, nothing official can go down. People are going to talk, and then you get to the combine, which is, again, all the agents, all the GMs in one building. People are going to bump into each other. Hey, did you get my text? So Albert Breer, one of those reporters sniffing around everything, must have been talking to Minnesota people and has sort of corroborated the vibe that I have been getting, which is, JJ McCarthy's knee looking very much like it's not going to be a factor at all in 2025, outside of the fact that he lost out on a few months of development. But it's not like a lingering thing as we understand it right now. He is ahead of schedule, even, is what Albert Breer said. He's basically doing everything right now, and there's not going to be any issue with him, with his concerns over his availability or anything like that. Everybody wants to say 2 surgeries. The second one was a scope. And they actually didn't do, it's crucial to understand, they didn't actually do any work on the knee. They did an arthroscopic surgery to look at it because there was some swelling, determined that swelling was not a concern, put a needle in there to drain some fluid, I think is what it was. Or maybe he got an injection of something, but it was an injection, not a surgery. And then that was that. So he is The knee is something we are, I think, pretty quickly going to be able to put behind us. It's going to be about the development. But, guys like Albert Breer, Tom Pelissero, Ian Rappaport, the guys that do get pretty direct information because they're the bigger names in reporting, right? These are the guys that can text Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and get an answer. And the thing is, the reason that they have that access is due in no small part to the fact that they aren't willing to run with something that they don't have the blessing to run with. They aren't going to have Kwesi answer a question and then go say that crap on TV without making sure it's okay with Kwesi. So that means you get a little bit of mouthpiecing, right? You get a little bit of, okay, it's very important, Albert, that when you go on the real Rich Eisen show and you talk about this, you mention that JJ McCarthy was very locked in throughout the whole season. Not to say that that's a false thing by any stretch of the imagination. It feels plausible enough for me. It passes the smell test, but I do think the smell test is important. And what it does is it complicates the Vikings, enamorment, is that a word, with Sam Darnold from this season. And it's funny because this wouldn't be the first time that JJ McCarthy did better than they thought at something, and it complicated their plans with Sam Darnold. And this is another thing Albert Breer mentioned, which bears repeating. It was reported at the time, and I talked about it a lot at the time. But right around that first preseason game, it was starting to bubble to the surface that the Vikings were considering JJ McCarthy for week 1. Personally, I thought we probably needed a little more time than that, but it was starting to bubble that it wasn't feeling as far-fetched as it was, when they drafted him and they went, "You're young, we're going to give you, at least half a year, and we're going to be really patient." And then camp came around and they were like, "Actually, maybe this kid's going to be ready. What are we going to do?" For me, what I saw of camp and preseason, the one preseason game, Sam Darnold was clearly the better quarterback, and I think they would have started him week 1 and had been correct to do so ultimately. But you were starting to hear counter arguments just like bubble around, and it was reports, it was rumors, it wasn't just people like me getting on a mic and saying we should. It was people saying like, "Hey, they're considering this," and they did consider it. This is now Albert Breer again, kind of confirming they did consider that, but it quickly became a moot point as the knee injury happened and he was out for the year. He would do his rehab work in practice. And this is, I think, the most detailed account of what JJ McCarthy's been doing is coming out. So I'm talking it out almost to help me memorize it and just to get it all out there. So this is JJ McCarthy's year, right? He would be in every team meeting. He would be all over, in all the team activities. He would be in the building. He would be present for all of that stuff. Not uncommon for players on IR to still go through all of those motions, but also not to be taken for granted. Some guys don't do that. Some guys aren't even in the building when they do their rehab. Sometimes guys aren't even in the state when they do their rehab, so it's worth pointing out. Then practice would come, the actual physical part of practice. JJ McCarthy would be doing his rehab work on the side. But other than that, he was locked in, was the way that Albert Breer described that. So the reason I'm going into all of this detail is to just paint a picture of a player that doesn't expect to just be forgotten. And we're now tipping over into my personal opinion, which is I would be really, really shocked if Sam Darnold got a full-length contract. I think it's either tag or walk. And I've thought this for some time. I have not been shy about that opinion. But again, it kind of feeds into that. It would just be really, really surprising to me if the way that the team has talked about McCarthy, approached McCarthy and his rehab and, worrying about, what's he going to be like in year 10? This is clearly the long-term guy. Every report we've ever heard has still said JJ McCarthy's the long-term guy. And if you sign Sam Darnold to a 3-year deal, you no longer have the rookie contract money benefit thing. That's the whole analytics-y deal that I know Kwesi wants really bad because he's an analytics guy. And it would just be very counterintuitive there. But it also, McCarthy is still the long-term answer for the franchise, and you want to turn that leaf, you want to turn that page as soon as you can, as soon as it's feasible to do that, once he's ready, both physically and mentally. So that the decision is, I think, between some kind of tag and letting Darnold walk. I don't think a tag and trade is the thing. I've explained this before in the past, but I don't actually think that gets you a better draft pick than the comp pick that you would get if you just let him walk. I think the value is better just for letting him walk. Plus, you don't incur a bunch of risk by taking on a $30 million fully guaranteed cap hit and then hoping somebody takes it off your hands. There's a reason that kind of thing doesn't really happen all in one go like it does in the NBA, where there's a sign and trade. It doesn't really, it only happens, teams getting traded while they're on the tag, when something changes. Like Cam Robinson was, I think he was on the tag, or maybe it was a 1-year deal, getting traded because the Jaguars' season went belly up. Or, guys getting traded in the middle of a tag because a contract negotiation was supposed to go better than it did. Like that kind of stuff. It's not really a thing you do just for the value of it, because I don't think the value is there. If it was, I think teams would try to do it more often. But I digress. That's where we're at with McCarthy. Ahead of schedule, Rehab looking great, and that they're comfortable with him being the quarterback in 2025, which means that as they go through this negotiation with Sam Darnold, they aren't going to be desperate. That's really what it is. They aren't. There's not really a lot of leverage that Darnold has, because the second it tips over whatever the asking price is that Kwesi's comfortable with, they can very easily and comfortably be like, all right, we'll go to the kid then, and not really be bummed about that. But just because that tag and trade thing is not really on my radar doesn't mean that trades aren't. We got some trade people. We got some rumors and stuff. Are the Vikings going to be interested? What do we do? How do we make a trade kind of thing work? Let's get into it on Locked On Vikings. Today's Locked On Vikings episode is brought to you by Gametime, the best place to find last-minute tickets. Gametime is my favorite place to get tickets whenever I'm especially trying to get to football games, whether they're Vikings games or, hey, I live in LA. I'll go to a game in SoFi, even if it's not the Vikings, with some friends. It's a fun thing to do. Went to a UCLA game this year. It was against the Gophers, so it still did get a little Minnesota in there. But hey, yeah, sure, let's go see one at the Rose Bowl. And it was spontaneous like that, which made Gametime great for looking to try to get deals on the tickets. Gametime has super deals that are, it's like their thing is the quote unquote super deals. You can't miss them on the app. They're like big red fire emoji, and they are the craziest deals that you will find. Somebody uploaded their ticket to some resale platform at a ridiculously low price because they didn't know any better. And Gametime's the app that's like tracking that down and showing you where you can get this one. This is the deal. Here it is. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Moving right along here with the Locked On Vikings podcast. Moving away from the rumor mill a little bit. This is still kind of like my opinions on this, my predictions on this kind of remain unchanged, which is they've got some options that they're willing to go for Darnold. They've got some limited short-term thing they're willing to go for Darnold. I don't see a lot of reason for Darnold to take that. Maybe he could surprise me and say yes for whatever reason, but free agency is a lot more lucrative for him, so I do kind of see him walking. And let's say he ends up, going to the LA Rams. Well, the LA Rams are up to something. They have told Cooper Kupp that they want to trade him. We actually talked about this on Locked On NFL today. You're going to check that out with me and Tyler Rowland. We went into those trade situations. And for me, I would be a little concerned about Cooper Kupp. I don't think that the draft compensation they get for Kupp is very high. I think they're selling pretty low because he's coming off of, for him, a down year. Now, for him, a down year is still like 700 yards, but that's not the number one receiver. I mean, he was like a receiving title type of guy for a couple of years, and I don't think you're getting receiving type of compensation. Excuse me. You're getting 700-yard kind of guy compensation. So I don't think the draft pick would be crazy, and I think even though the Vikings don't have a lot of draft capital, that would be fine. And the Rams have even said they're willing to take on some of the money. So I don't think that the price would be very high, and I don't think the reward would be very high. So if the Vikings ended up doing it, as long as they don't end up, paying a bunch of money and a first-round pick or something like that, sure. Obviously, the wide receiver room the Vikings have is, I think, one of the strongest rooms in their whole roster, right? Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison are, I'm going to say, the best duo in the league and be a homer about it. I know you could make arguments about like the Bengals or whatever, but that's not staying together. But I don't know, you fight somebody else about that. But if not arguably the best duo in the league, right? And adding Cooper Kupp to it, I don't think he's wide receiver 2 on this team. Not the way he's playing right now. So you're paying for a wide receiver, sure, right? To me, it moves the needle about as much as what if they brought back KJ Osborne, which I actually would be kind of in favor of. Like, sure, man, bring him back. We love it. There's a lot of wide receivers that are potentially on the trade market. There's actually a recently published PFF list from about a month ago of potential trade targets. And a lot of it is like quarterbacks like Deshaun Watson and Derek Carr, Kirk Cousins, and, those kinds of guys. But they had some other interesting ideas that are potentially worth looking into. Obviously, the other big one, though, we'll get to that list in a minute and maybe some other people's lists of like ideas for trade candidates. But obviously, the other big one is Myles Garrett, who has requested a trade from the Cleveland Browns, and good for him. No, edge rusher just makes no sense for what the Vikings would have to pay, right? And let's chase this rabbit. Like let's not just dismiss it because the Vikings already have a room with Grenard, Van Ginkel, Dallas Turner. That room is where it needs to be, and the resources probably should be spent elsewhere. But let's say that you don't worry about that redundancy. Personally, redundancy is not a thing that I'm really that scared of, so I don't even think that that's like that persuasive a point. But let's look at where this goes, right? You spend your first and your third, which is probably about what it's going to be, on Myles Garrett. You give that to the Browns. You take on a big giant cap hit. And now you've got the most stacked edge room in the league, right? Like you just have the bet. You've got 3 Pro Bowlers and a first rounder as your 4th guy. That's an insanely stacked room. You have no corners. I mean, genuinely, Mekhi Blackmon is the only guy with any starting experience on the roster right now, like under a contract at all. You have no. You have 2 giant holes at safety, assuming Harrison Smith doesn't retire, or assuming Harrison Smith retires, or then 1 giant hole at safety if he doesn't, because Bynum's leaving. You have a patchwork O-line that you're probably just going to have to run it back with Ed Ingram if you don't do something about it. You need a quarterback to pair with JJ McCarthy. You need a running back. I mean, we've talked so much about the Vikings' needs, right? So with that much less money and functionally no draft, you got 2 5th-round picks. You don't have a draft. You just don't get to be in the draft this year. Was that worth it right now? Probably not to me. I think the returns are a little bit too diminishing for that to be worth it. And I think the Vikings have simply too many needs and too much stuff they have to do with their money to go that crazy on any one guy. And I think that's a reason in general not to really expect them to go for the big fish at any position. The Trey Smith, it kills me, but the DJ Reader, Charvarius Ward, I don't know if they have the luxury of landing any one huge guy because they need to get like 10 guys. Some of those guys can be, vet min types. Some of them can be, reclamation projects. You can't get 1 expensive free agent and 9 reclamation projects, though. That big free agent might not even be the best guy of the whole group. Free agents bust out all the time. There's tons of Olivier Vernons out there. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I actually just went on the Pack a Day podcast, which is a Packers show, a guy named Andy Herman. I love Andy Herman. Even though he roots for the wrong team, he's misguided. Okay. I forgive my friends. And I went on his show and we talked a little bit about Myles Garrett and how much more sense it makes for a team like the Packers that have a terrible pass rush and, a whole bunch of guys that are aging out. Like they have nothing, right? The Vikings have a room that is already stacked. If they're going to go out and start throwing around first rounders for trades, give me a corner, give me a defensive tackle, right? Bring me Chris Jones then, right? Bring me Dexter Lawrence or somebody like that. Or, I don't know, maybe somebody with fewer allegations. But, hey, we know Kwesi doesn't really care about that, so I digress. So I'm not too into those ideas, really. The Cooper Kupp one is just whatever. I feel like it would be... I think it would be appropriately cheap, but by the kind of same sword, it wouldn't move the needle for me. And the Myles Garrett one just kind of seems like weird wish fulfillment. That's someone else's thing. Okay. Let that be someone else's adventure. But there are other possible ideas out there that have been posited by people who are more willing to do listicles than I am. And so we're going to go take advantage of that next on Locked On Vikings. Today's Locked On Vikings episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the best place to play daily fantasy football. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and so simple to get in on the action. All you got to do is pick more or less on your favorite player and whatever their PrizePicks projection is. It's just you versus the house. And right now, they've got a promo going on. They've got a couple promos going on right now, and you can check them out in the promos tab. So they've got these super sweet Millie winners, big game lineups. That means if you tail one of those lineups and it goes 3 for 3, you split $1 million in promo funds. You can also go just throw Patrick Mahomes to get 1 yard. Just needs the one passing yard. Feels pretty easy. If you pair that with one more correct pick, say Saquon Barkley to get a touchdown or Jalen Hurts to get a touchdown or whatever, even like a really conservative Goblin square, which is like a lower payout, but also a lower amount, you can just like tack that on with Patrick Mahomes and boom, you are cashing out. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Moving on here, let's talk about some other real trade asset names for the Locked On Vikings podcast. There are a few different ideas that kind of come up a lot, but the one I've seen the most often for the Vikings is Martin Emerson. He is a cornerback for the Cleveland Browns. And the Browns are one of these teams in deep cap hell because of that Deshaun Watson contract. They'll get out of it. There's actually been a couple of people who've done interesting kind of mock off seasons about how the Browns can get out of it. And they can with some reasonable figuring, and also there might be a clause in the Deshaun Watson contract that kind of lets him up a little bit, but they are sort of in a bad situation where, you know, good talent is going to walk out that door. And Martin Emerson might be one of those guys. He's a Mississippi State corner. He's been in the league for a couple of years. He was a round 3 pick a few years ago, but he might not fit into Cleveland's future plans. I feel like this would be one because like he is like looking at getting an extension that Cleveland won't be able to give him, right? So he's going to be kind of looking for that, but it's not happening now. And he's not, I mean, they've got Denzel Ward, right? Like they've got other names over there. So it does feel like somebody you could maybe kind of slip in and get for, you know, you're not sending a first round pick for that. You're sending something a little bit less and maybe even a player in return, depending on what kind of things that they're looking for there. I also like an idea, a couple of interesting ideas for like older players that come from either PFF or from Bleacher Report or like these kind of listicle type sites that for older defensive tackles, guys like Grady Jarrett. Grady Jarrett will be dirt cheap. And he's more of a name than he is an asset at this point. But, I mean, we're talking 5th for 6th and shed some cap, right? Because Atlanta's trying to get under the cap. They got to get it. Their Kirk Cousins contract is giving them trouble. And so they might want to like shed some money. So he would cost like 16 mil, which on our cap environment wouldn't be too bad. And the Vikings, you know, and you could kind of spread all that out and figure out how to avoid your way out of making that too big of a thing that stops you from doing other free agency stuff, right? Because, I mean, that's like more than what it would be projected to get one of the top corners in this class, right? So you would probably want to do some conniving there. But, or somebody like DeForest Buckner, perhaps. But one of these sort of older names, this is the Kwesi thing. Somebody asked me in this yesterday's mailbag, like, how do you think about day 3 guys? And I think the like reclamation project free agency type thing is a really similar logic. Somebody who's cheap for maybe a dumb reason. You know, AJ, nothing but a number. And so if you get an older guy, assuming that they haven't fallen off the cliff as much as their age would imply, their age might get overweighted in the value assessment that leads to the trade. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's not that it doesn't matter if you're old. It might just be that the market may overreact to that, and that means you stand to gain value. I like that idea to get some kind of, somebody who can be useful in the pass rush without being totally useless in the run, without getting washed around all the time. But I wouldn't get your hopes up for this guy being, a Pro Bowl superstar, not on the trade market. And I think, like, if he's that good, they ain't letting him out the door. Unless you're willing to go spend 2 first-round picks and do the whole thing, which I don't think the Vikings are in a position to really do. Even at a position of need, let alone one not of need like edge rusher. But in a similar vein, someone like Jack Jones, who my perception of Jack Jones was that his season was up and down in Vegas. But, an interesting player, one that I think fits the Flores mold. He like jumps too much stuff. That's like kind of the deal with him, right? I don't know. Raiders fans totally correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm super off base there. But that was kind of my idea, is that he takes the cheese a lot, kind of Andrew Boothy in that way, but not to the point where you become an unrosterable player, which is what Andrew Booth is. But that is a workable idea if it's under control just enough so that you even can get on the ball, because you can actually get interceptions, and Jack Jones has. Again, Vegas is in a spot where they are looking real hard for a quarterback. They pick 6th. So going for one of those guys in the draft probably isn't a great idea. I mean, I just don't like those guys as much. I reserve the right to go back on that opinion, by the way, once I'm done. I'm like halfway through Cam Ward and that's it. But from what I've saw just like on TV of Shedeur Sanders and then just like reputation, like this isn't exactly like last year's QB class, right? And so maybe one of those guys does fall to 6, but maybe you don't even like that. Might be like 2013 in that way. But I digress. They're going to be using a lot of resources for that. And this would be the thing, and I'm going to say it now. I see a lot of people talking about the Raiders potentially, landing Sam Darnold, which I think is very plausible, would call them a front runner in that way. But also like trading for JJ McCarthy. And to kind of wrap this back around to where we started, it's not happening. No. I cross my heart and hope to die. I mean, that just doesn't match anything we've heard at all from reporters on the podium, from even rumors and conjecture about the way that JJ McCarthy's development is being prioritized in Minnesota. Look, I hear from a lot of people who tell me how long they've been watching the Vikings. And usually that's when I'm being too optimistic for people and they go, I've been watching them for 40 years. You just wait. It'll fall apart, as though I don't know that. But I think that context is in my head a lot. When people are like, well, you never know, we are not trading Percy Harvin. Remember that quote from 22 years ago or 12 years ago? And I think if you've been paying attention to the Vikings for that long, or even just more than a few years, if you've been watching the Vikings since like, I don't know, before COVID, you probably have enough evidence to notice the pattern that kind of tells you when a guy is about to get traded and when he's not. A guy who's about to get traded is one with a lot of unguaranteed money or so much guaranteed base salary that it's impossible to cut him. And then you trade him away anyways, so you just don't take as much dead cap on, the Jesse Davis thing. But mostly it's people who are at the tail end of their time in Minnesota. The relationship has deteriorated and they're just trying to kind of recoup a little bit of value or see what is going on. And the buying team has to be in a desperate spot as well. So none of that applies to JJ McCarthy. I think whenever I see that, it's these kind of nationalistical type articles from people who from a distance noticed that Sam Darnold played well and went, well, what if they stick with him and trade away the rookie? Okay, type it up. And it kind of, the thought only really goes that deep. But for people like you and I, dear listener, I think we know. I think we can be pretty confident that the way the Vikings have approached JJ McCarthy, the way they behave around JJ McCarthy, the way they talk, both publicly and privately to reporters for them to go then parrot, is abundantly clear that that's not an option on the table. I mean, abundantly clear. And if you're looking at all of that evidence and positing otherwise, you're either not paying attention or you're grifting. And I don't really respect it either way. We can pay attention, you and I, right? We're Locked On Vikings. We do a show every day. We can pay attention. We don't really have to listen to people who don't have time for that. Good for them. They can spend their time on something else if they want. But for us, we don't really have to give that the time of day, which is why I'm shoving this at the end of a show. So tomorrow and Friday, I've got 2 consecutive interviews with people who were at the Senior Bowl and Shrine Bowl. So we're going to talk a little bit about some draft stuff headed into the Super Bowl. Both of those conversations were pre-recorded, so I actually know what they are. Both kind of steered into really great directions, really interesting philosophical talk about the draft and, late round guys. Some really great stuff. Both those guys have been on the show before, Tyler Forness and Kevin Fielder. So if you are an everydayer, you know them. Really excited to share that with you. So we will be there shortly. See y'all for that. And as always, Skol.